Hey Bio 30s, let's get going. So today we're going to talk about oogenesis and the process of making an egg or an ova. And this process is similar in a sense that we already discussed spermatogenesis and the process of making sperm, going from a primary spermatocyte to a secondary spermatocyte to a spermatid, and then eventually sperm. Same kind of idea with oogenesis. We're going to go from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte, and both processes are examples of meiosis, which is where we produce our sex cells or our gametes. Now, what's going to happen here is we have these cells and this tissue called follicles. This is located in the ovaries, and the follicles themselves will allow the development of the primary oocyte. So inside of the follicles, we have the primary oocyte. Now remember, the spermatogonium produces the primary spermatocyte. The oogonium will produce the primary oocyte. This primary oocyte will grow and develop into a secondary oocyte and then later on into an ovum. Now, with that secondary oocyte, so as the menstrual cycle goes on, and this is roughly about 28 days, as the menstrual cycle goes on, the primary oocyte and the primary follicle will grow and develop. Eventually, there'll be about midpoint, a surge in a hormone. This hormone is actually the luteinizing hormone, LH. There'll be a surge in LH, and this will cause the oocyte to escape or burst out of the follicle and burst out of the ovary. This is now a secondary oocyte. And what's left over is what we call the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is this structure right here. So you'll notice that we have an empty follicle, and this empty follicle will actually grow into what's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is really important because it secretes the female hormones estrogen and progesterone, which are essential in maintaining the lining of the uterus needed for pregnancy. Now, if no pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum will eventually degenerate, and this whole cycle will repeat itself. So let's take a look at this diagram here. This is a diagram of an ovary. We can see the blood vessels going into the ovary, delivering oxygen and nutrients and things like that. So every month, the ovaries are going to be hit with some hormones. They're going to be hit with FSH and LH. You may remember these hormones from the male system. Remember, FSH and LH are both involved in sperm production. FSH more with sperm production, LH with the making of testosterone. So FSH and LH are going to be involved with the female system as well. The job of FSH, or the follicle stimulating hormone, is to allow the follicles to grow. Now, ladies are born with every follicle they're going to have for their entire life. And usually when you enter into, age 13, 14, 15, whatever it might be, you hit puberty. And this is when the hormones are going to start developing those follicles, but it's only one follicle a month. So some follicles might start growing, you get multiple follicles growing, but only one of them is going to be the primary follicle. That's going to be the biggest follicle. And inside of that primary follicle is our primary oocyte. So our primary oocyte is going to get larger and larger and larger as the menstrual cycle goes on. Now, roughly day 14, like I was saying, in ovulation, what's going to happen is this primary oocyte is going to escape the follicle and burst out of the follicle during ovulation. During this stage, it's going to transform from a primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte. Now, very similar where we had our cell, right? 23 chromosomes. It will divide into two cells with 23 chromosomes. Now, when we're talking about the primary spermatocytes becoming the secondary spermatocytes, it's equal. Everything's equal, everything's split evenly. But when we're talking about oocytes, it's not. So one oocyte, which we now call the secondary oocyte, this one would be the primary, the secondary oocyte takes almost all the cytoplasm, all the organelles, all the cytoplasm, leaving the second cell here, which would be much, much smaller. We call this one the polar body. All right? And there's a reason that the oocyte takes all of the cytoplasm, and we'll get to that later on when we talk about fertilization and things like that. But as of right now, The process is the same, but just note that the secondary oocyte is grabbing most of the cytoplasm, so it's not an even division, right? It's like if we had a pie. I really enjoy pie. So if we had a pie, I would take 9 pieces of the pie, and then you would get 1. That's not really fair. It should be 50-50, right? It should be 5 and 5 if there were 10 pieces of pie. But instead, I'm getting 9 and you're getting 1. That's what's happening here. One cell is getting most of the cytoplasm, the other cell is not getting very much. Now, that secondary oocyte is then going to enter into the fallopian tube, and what's left over is, of course, our corpus luteum. So now we have our corpus luteum developing, and this is going to be really important when we talk about the menstrual cycle and where all these hormones are coming from. Now, the last thing I want to go over with you here is the comparison between oogenesis and spermatogenesis. You'll notice some similarities as well as some differences, so let's get into it. Number 1, we have a primary oocyte and a primary spermatocyte. Now, the 2N, N, you don't really need to focus on right now, so I'm just going to cross that out, make it a little easier for you. And we're just going to put 46, right? This cell has 46 chromosomes, and then this cell has 46 chromosomes. So, both cells have 46 chromosomes, and we're going to undergo a division. It's called meiosis 1. So it's going to be meiosis 1. What happens during meiosis 1 is we have a split. So we have a split here. Now this cell has 23 chromosomes, and this cell has 23 chromosomes. This cell has 23 chromosomes, and this cell has 23 chromosomes. Now, quick refresher, what's a chromosome? It's like a packet of DNA. It contains DNA, it contains your genes, it contains your genetic information that gives you your hair color, your eye color, things like that. So you'll notice that both splitting the same, right? 2 cells, each with 23 chromosomes. The key difference is both of these cells are the same size. These ones are not, right? That's that uneven splitting I was talking about. It's uneven, the cytoplasm distribution. Now, back over to spermatogenesis. We then have our second division where we take our secondary spermatocyte and it becomes a spermatid. These spermatids will eventually grow and develop into sperm in the epididymis. All right, back to oogenesis. Notice that the second division doesn't actually happen until fertilization occurs. So you're actually not going to get your fully formed ovum until fertilization. So what happens during fertilization? Well, a sperm and an egg will come together. So here's our sperm, 23 chromosomes. And here is our secondary oocyte. They will combine and we'll get our second division, so our second splitting. We get a second polar body, and we now have a mature ovum. This mature ovum will combine its 23 chromosomes with the sperm's 23 chromosomes to form a 46 chromosome cell known as a zygote. So, for right now, what I would need you to focus on, or the key takeaways from this lesson, would be oogenesis. The process of making an egg involves 2 divisions. It involves going from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte, and then eventually to an ovum. This occurs in the ovary as well as the fallopian tube, and there are some hormones involved, but those hormones we'll discuss later when we talk about the menstrual cycle.